Alright, so now let's look at part B of 4, where we're going to be implementing this countIncreasingCols method. Basically what this does is it returns the number of columns in the grid that are in increasing order. It's going to be in increasing order if the element in every single row after the first row is greater than or equal to the element in the previous row. So if at any point you have one number and the number below it in that column is smaller than that number, then we would not say that that column is in increasing order. Let's go ahead and write some pseudocode to start off with. So we know that we're going to be returning an int. That is going to be the number of columns that are in increasing order. So we're probably going to want to initialize a variable for number of columns in increasing order. Next, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to loop over the outer array. In this problem, this is going to be slightly different than 4a. The reason why is our outer loop is not going to be which row we're looking at. Instead, it's going to be which column we're looking at. It's a very slight distinction, but it's very important. So before, our outer for loop was keeping track of which row we were currently looking at, and then our inner for loop was keeping track of which index in that array we were looking at. Now it's going to be flipped, where we're going to be looking at that first column. That's going to be our outer array, and our inner array is going to be which row we're looking at. So I mentioned the outer array is the column. So we also want to loop over the inner array, which is going to be the rows. And the next one we want to do is determine if the column is in increasing order. And what that looks like is going down the column, looping through every row and comparing it to the number above it. And if at any point the number above it is greater, then we know that the column is not in increasing order. Once we've looped over that inner array, we can add 1 to the number of columns in increasing order if above is true. And then once we're done looping over the outer array, once we've looked at all of the columns, we can return the number of columns in increasing order. Okay, so that looks good for our pseudocode. So let's go ahead and convert it into real code. So we've got an int, remember, because we're returning an int. We got to initialize an int. Let's call it num columns. And we're going to start that off at 0. Loop over the outer array. So as I mentioned, this is going to be slightly different than 4a. And the reason why is because our outer array is which column we're in. So to make this kind of easy on us, I'm going to call it int col equals 0. Start off at the first column in our array. And then we say col is less than. We still have that matrix grid. So we'll say grid. And you might be tempted to do grid.length here, but grid.length is incorrect. Remember that matrices in Java are row major. So what you're getting when you do grid.length is the number of rows. But since we are looking at the columns, instead we want how many columns there are. So that would be, we grab the first array in our matrix and we get its length. That'll give us how many columns we have. And then we do col plus plus. Awesome. So that's our outer loop. Our inner loop is going to be the row, which row we're currently in. So we say int row equals 0. Row is less than grid.length. Remember, we're now looking at the rows. So grid.length will tell us how tall the matrix is. Row plus plus. Okay, and now we need to determine if the column is in increasing order. We do this a couple of ways. The way that I like is comparing it to the value above itself. We can say something like if grid at, so what's the first number we're going to be looking at? The first number will be the row index, remember, because to get the number at the top left part of our matrix, we need to do 0, 0, where 0 is the row. So we're going to index it using row first and then column. And we need to see if that is strictly less than the number above it. So to get the value above it, we need to do grid at row -1. So that gives us the row above us. And then we want to keep the column the same because, we're comparing every number within the same column. Okay, so if that's true, then we know that we're not in increasing order. What we're going to want to do is initialize a Boolean outside here that's is increasing. We can set that equal to true by default, and then we can set it equal to false here. We just need one instance in which the element at a certain index in the column is smaller than the one above. If you're a keen listener or watcher, you'll notice that I'm going to have an issue here with my for loop. It's all fine and dandy that I'm doing this, but is there a problem here? Yeah, so we initialize row to be 0, but then we try to get the value of grid at 0 - 1. So we're going to have an index out of bounds error here because you can't get the value at the -1 index. What does that even mean? So you're going to have to start this at 1 instead of 0. So now it'll be fine that we're looking at the previous row because for the first run of this for loop, we're going to be comparing grid 1 and comparing it to, we'll be comparing the top left element in our grid versus the element in the first column in the second row. So we've got that kind of figured out. Next, what we need to do is use our Boolean that is keeping track of whether we're increasing to increment the number of columns in increasing order. So we can write a little if statement here. So if is increasing, remember this is a Boolean, so we don't need to say equals true or anything like that because this evaluates to true or false. So if this is true, if the column is increasing, if we didn't find an element in which the row below it is smaller, what we're going to do is we're going to say num columns plus. And then, last but not least, we can return num columns. And so one of the reasons why we want to do this if statement outside of the inner for loop is we have to go through the entire column before we can determine if the column is increasing. But we also want to make sure that we're doing it inside of the outer for loop because we're doing this for every single column inside of our matrix. Let's go ahead and test it on the example grid that we're given. We're going to start at column equals 0, and we're going to check if that is less than the number of columns are, which is 3. So that's true. We do go into that. So now we're going to start at row equals 1, and there are also 3 rows. So we're going to check that that is less than 3, also true. So we enter the inner for loop. Now we're comparing grid at grid at 1, 0, whether that's less than grid at 0, 0. So that is checking whether 20 is less than 10. That's not true. So we skip over that and we move on to the next row. 2 is less than 3. So now this gets updated to 2, this gets updated to 1. What we're looking at here is whether 30 is less than 20. It's also incorrect, so is increasing is still true. Now we are on to the third row. 3 is not less than 3, so we're done with our inner for loop. So we can increment num columns by 1. Num columns is now 1. Okay, we have established that the first column is increasing. Now let's move on to the next column. So 1 is less than 3. That is true. We move back to the second row. So this changes to 1. That changes to 1 as well. We're now looking at the second column. This is 0 and this is 1. So what we're looking at here is whether 40 is less than 50. That is true. So you'll notice that if you just look at it normally, you'll see, okay, it's not increasing because 40 is less than 50. We need it to either equal or be greater than. So is increasing is false. We could go through the rest of this for loop, but since we've set it to false, there's no more logic to set it to true. So I'm not going to waste your time or my time. So we can say that it's false and this number does not get incremented for our second column. All right, let's move on to the third and last column. We start at row 1 again. We compare it to the row above it. So this would be 1, 2. And we're comparing it to 0, 2. So is 20 less than 40? Yes, it is. So once again, this column is not increasing, so we don't go into this if statement, we don't increase num columns, so we return 1 for this first example. Here is what count increasing calls looks like if we get rid of all the pseudocode.